Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL round number 3 overview and analysis video in the summer playoffs. This is really the last big break point in the LPL playoffs. Winning here today puts you into the top 4, which is obviously prestigious enough on its own. It gives you quite a few championship points to potentially qualify for that regional qualifier, but alongside that, of course, that means you enter the double elimination stage of the bracket. So probably the most important series of the entire tournament up until this point here in round number 3. I'm excited to go over it. Hope you guys are excited as well. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened up until this point, check out the LPL playlist up in the iCard. That's every single week of the regular season, as well as everything in the playoffs so far. Up in that iCard is also just individually going to be the round number 2 video, because at the end of that, we did quickly preview the round number 3 matchups that we are getting here today. If you want to know my thoughts on who I expect to be moving on into round 4, into that double elimination stage, please check out that video, because I go into it a little bit more in depth than I will in this video. We'll still talk about it, what my expectations were a little bit, but most of that's going to be done in that video. So without further ado, I don't want to waste you guys' time. Let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the round number 3 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will preview our round 4 matchups, give a quick overview of where things stand in terms of the regional qualifier at the end of this video, which we will know all 6 teams that have ended up qualifying by the end of this video, just by nature of the way that the championship point system works out. We're going to know who the final team eliminated is, depending on who ends up winning or losing their series at the end of this video, but we'll quickly go over that, and then of course, you know, like I said, we'll talk about round 4. We'll kind of preview what you can expect maybe for the rest of the playoffs with the 4 teams that we know are going to be playing the rest of the games for the LPL this year. So let's get right into it. Again, I don't like wasting too much of your time at the beginning. It's fun to go over these games. It's not fun to hear me talk. So let's start with our first round number 3 series, and that was one of the more interesting ones. I certainly think this was, of the 2 matchups here in round 3, the closer one on paper for me. It's a matchup between the number 4 seeded Weibo Gaming and the number 9 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas. You would think that this would be the bigger gap between the 2 teams, because NIP is coming from the play-in stage and they didn't win a single game in Group Ascend, and there were a lot of things going wrong for this team, but a lot has changed for them over the course of the playoffs. Obviously, Leon's inclusion into the roster has been a pretty big positive for them overall, but it's not just Leon coming in that has made them better. He's been okay. He's been good, I would say, throughout this playoff run, but really, when you're looking at the players that have carried NIP up until this point, it's Rookie in the mid lane, and honestly, more specifically, it's Juo in the support position, who has been phenomenal for NIP. Those 2 players have really been kind of the pressure points on the map for NIP throughout this entire run. Juo has been the primary engage threat for what NIP wants to do. He's kind of the playmaker on the team, and when they're looking to try to make anything happen, really, they're doing it through him. They're kind of waiting for his go button. Now, that's not to say that he's the only player that ends up making those calls. Rookie can sometimes be one to make those calls. Leon has been known to sometimes make those calls and just force an engage, but he's been playing mostly these AP junglers. It's basically been entirely Zyra, except for 1 game over the course of the playoffs up until this point, and then Shanji also, I think, has been significantly better than anything he was, not only in the regular season, but in the spring split as well, even when this team did end up making top 4. And so everything is just kind of going right now for NIP, and I think that that's obviously a big positive. And then you've got their opponent, Weibo Gaming, on the other side, and certainly I think that there is a conversation to be had about them individually as a team and as players. Reddit tried to convince me a couple of months ago that they were frauds. Same thing with NIP. This is a bit of a quote-unquote fraud off, and as per usual, Reddit overreacted and ended up being incorrect, as tends to be the case when it comes specifically to the LPL. But Weibo is one of those teams where I just have no idea how good or how bad they currently are. It is very difficult to get a read on them individually because of just how volatile every single player on the team is. When you're looking for a star, it's clearly Tarzan in the jungle. He has been the one to actively push them forward the entirety of this split, even though there have been quite a few moments where players like Breathe and Zhao, who have been not so good, quite frankly, Tarzan has been pretty tremendous, and I think for a lot of people, he's going to be, you know, like an MVP contender contender. You know, he was up there in terms of the pressure that he was able to put on and the amount of value that he added to Weibo over the course of this year. And so he's going to be incredibly important in this series, especially going into someone like Leon, who can be taken off of his comfort. And, you know, when he is taken off of comfort and taken out of his comfort zone, typically speaking, he plays a lot worse. And so we'll have to see if Tarzan can get the upper hand there. But, you know, the solo laners are also going to be very important. Xiaohu and Rookie was highlighted on broadcast as the series, the key matchup to watch. And I understand why completely. Rookie has been so important to NIP, and Xiaohu has been a bit of a liability to Weibo. When you're looking at opportunities for NIP to actually gain advantages in this series, Rookie is probably the lane, and mid lane is probably the lane you're looking at the most in terms of those advantages. So we'll have to see if Xiaohu can just be, you know, generally okay. I think that would be good enough for Weibo to win the series. Same thing with Breathe on the top side. If both of them are better in terms of the solo lanes, I certainly think Tarzan will be better in the jungle. I think Weibo should have this series pretty easy. That's not even talking about the fact that Light and Crisp are just better than Photic and Juwo. Well, I should say that Light is certainly better than Photic. Crisp has certainly had his problems over the course of this year, but he is a known playoff performer, somebody who steps up in big moments. Even if Juwo has been good, I think both supports are, you know, expected to be solid in this series, and so I think a lot of it's going to be down to the solo lanes. But we'll see how that ends up going. My prediction for this series was Weibo Gaming, but I said it was so much closer to a 50-50 than it was to anything else. I'm not going to be surprised if it's a blowout in either direction. I think both of these teams have a case to be made that they match up favorably against the other, whether you want to think that Tarzan could be able to take advantage of Leon's weaknesses in terms of consistency, or that Rookie's going to be able to take advantage of Xiaohu, or that you could expect Shanji to have a good series. All of those things I think are possible, and so I could really genuinely see this series going either way, especially with NIP's momentum behind them. But the only way to know how it ended up going is to actually cover the games, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0 here, and this was a pretty beautiful game number 1 from them. Not everything went entirely perfect. You had moments where Xiaohu and Light were getting caught in a side lane for no reason, where Light was stepping up on a dive and just taking tower aggro for no reason, but for the most part, this was a super clean game from Weibo. They were able to get out to a pretty early lead here, up 1k gold at like 6 or 7 minutes into the game, just purely off of Tarzan farming incredibly efficiently on the brand. It's just kind of what happens on that champion. And they were able to kind of push that out as quickly as they possibly could into this gigantic mid-game advantage. They end up taking a couple of fights 4-0, and the game is over at that point. There's really no way for NIP to be able to come back. I think one thing to note, Weibo Gaming does ban out the Zyra in this ban phase. It's really the first time that this has been forced off of Leon. He's basically exclusively played this champion ever since coming into NIP, and we'll talk about it. He looked significantly worse off of Zyra. Perhaps that is a bit of a comfort pick and a comfort zone for him. I'm really happy to see a team at least ask whether or not he can be taken off of it. NIP actually bans out the Nidalee, which has been the permaban against Leon. Just very intriguing to see the direction that they wanted to go here, but let's give praise to the Weibo Gaming players. First player of the game is very obviously going to go to Crisp in the support position. Phenomenal game from Crisp. There really is nothing else to say other than unbelievable, engages, pretty good laning phase, especially keeping Light safe. I think that, you know, obviously they tried to 3-man bot early on in the game. Crisp did a great job of outplaying that. Light also did a great job, but the setups at the end of the game, that's really what you're looking for. You're looking for these 3-man rel ultimates at the end of the game that end up just completely swinging it in favor of Weibo. There was really nothing NIP could do because Crisp was always on a flank or always peeling for the right target or engaging perfectly at the right time. There really just was not a flaw to Crisp's game. This was about as perfect of a game number 1 as you could possibly ask from him. I think in terms of damage, there were a lot of players that ended up doing really well. Light had one miracle bullet time around, I think it was like 2nd or 3rd dragon, that ended up just like really destroying the entirety of NIP and got Light super far ahead. It was really well set up by Crisp, but a lot of the bullet times this game were actually really good. Xiaohu was incredibly good in these fights outside of the one random one where he just tries to dive bot turret after they win a fight and just dies for no reason. I think outside of that play, he was actually pretty solid this game. Tarzan was of course up like 2 or 3k gold just purely off of the CS lead that he had. Even if he was a little bit more inconsistent in fights, they were definitely targeting him in terms of who they wanted to target in a lot of these skirmishes, and Breathe was awesome. The flanks were incredible. I mean, the Zeri flanks were also great too, but Weibo just had a really good idea of how they wanted to play out the late game here, the end game, the 5v5s, and that's really what kind of pushed them over the top in a game that they were already doing rather well in. So really clean, really fun game from Weibo Gaming. Not so good for NIP. I think some of their flaws, some of their weaknesses were more exposed in this game than they were in the previous series. First of all, Leon off of Zyra, no go. Like that looked so horrible. The Ivern at the very least in this game was miserable. He was down in gold, down in CS the entirety of the game, really without doing anything to justify it. He was trying to put a ton of pressure into the Ezreal Braum lane, into the bot lane. Just a horrible decision. I genuinely do not understand what the idea was for Leon. In this one, he sacrificed basically his entire game in order to try and get Ezreal ahead of like a misfortune. It just feels very strange. It was bad pathing, bad decision making, and he played Ivern really poorly in the back half of the game as well. Really easy choice for dead of the game, and especially because there already were questions about whether or not he was going to perform well off of the Zyra. To see it go so poorly here in the first game off of it, it's certainly not encouraging. I also want to shout out Shanji, who, like, the scoreline looks okay, but the gameplay was not. Like, there are real problems to Aurora as a pick. She's not this consistent insta-win that I think a lot of people like to make her out to be, especially in the West. I've said for a while that I think Aurora is a bit overrated at the moment. I think she's very strong, but she doesn't do everything. Her laning isn't particularly good. She's not really all that strong in the 1v1. It's definitely better in the top lane when you're going against a lot of these melee carries, but it's certainly not great, and really her big selling point is her pick potential in the later half of the game. And so if your team is super far behind, especially, you know, which is especially possible, I should say, because she isn't very good in the early game, then all of a sudden this champ doesn't really do anything. Like, she's really not all that strong. She was often getting picked off, caught out in a lot of these moments. Shanji was just way too far forward. I think this is a good example of why Aurora isn't broken. She is strong, don't get me wrong, especially if the team is already in a good state. It basically makes it impossible for an enemy mid laner or AD carry to attempt to get back into the game. But when you have to play from disadvantage, there's really not a lot that this champion can actually do, and we saw that here. Fodic wasn't particularly good. I still think Rookie and Juo were the strength of this team. Juo was actually really good in this game on the Braum. He did a lot of really interesting things. It just didn't really matter. You can only do so much on that champion when everybody else in the game is losing. But Leon lost super hard. Shanji was throwing away EXP and gold in the late game for basically nothing. Just wasn't a very clean performance from NIP, and they're going to have to be better moving into game number 2. If this is what you're getting out of this team, that's going to be a bit of a problem. Weibo has all of the momentum right now, and especially if they continue to perform as cleanly as they did in this game, I think it's going to be just fine. A couple of mistakes, but outside of that, this was a very good game from them, and so we'll have to see how game 2 ends up going. Is Weibo going to be able to take that dominant 2-0 series lead, or is NIP going to do what they've basically done this entire tournament and make things very intriguing? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a back and forth series on our hands. At the very least, through the first 2 games, it looks pretty darn good. This was even more of a blowout than game number 1. Game 1 was very clean from Weibo. There were a lot of good things from them. They really didn't make any egregious mistakes at the very least. They made some mistakes, but none of them were like game-losing mistakes. But this was just a slaughter. This was NIP getting super far ahead and just being unable to lose any fight from like 12 minutes on, because Rookie was just so fed on the Zeri. Anytime he was involved in anything that NIP was doing, they just immediately won. It truly was exceptional play from their star mid laner. He is the easiest possible choice for player of the game here. Very similar to what I said about Crisp in game number 1. Just no other way to look at this. He was the most important player for NIP. They played almost entirely around him in the back half of the game, and Rookie has been that guy, that dude, if you will, for NIP throughout this entire playoff run. Hell, throughout this entire year, he's kind of been that guy. I mean, really, there has not been a point where he has not been as good as he was. I'm not going to say maybe when he won Worlds, because that's just like a legendary level of play that Rookie was on at that point, but I mean, this is pretty close to career peak for Rookie in terms of the highs that we've seen. Now, has it always been that consistent? No, it is definitely not. He's had some really bad games and some bad series over the course of this year, but the good ones, to me, are just as good as they've ever been for Rookie, and we continue to see that. Juo is also just really freaking good at Leona. He's just so good in general, was able to create so much. The team trusts him so much in terms of what they ask him to do. He is the only person with a go button in this entire comp, and they really were like, okay, you either win us some of these fights or you lose us some of these fights by the decisions that you end up making, and they trust him with that role, and he ends up coming in clutch. He has been unbelievable in this playoff run. I was really talking him up a lot in 2023. Last year when he was on NIP, I was like, Fodic is really garbage, but Juo's doing some really interesting things down in the bot lane. Obviously, they were very good in spring. Summer's been a bit of a problem for Zhuo. I think it's been his weakest split on NIP, at least as a starter, but I think for the most part, he's still a player that actually intrigues me. I think he's about as good as a lot of these other supports that keep getting jobs in a lot of different areas. I think he can be a top 6 or top 7 support in the LPL. I think the expectation for him when he was coming up as a rookie was to be, one of the better supports in the world. I don't think that's ever going to happen for Zhuo, but he can be a valuable piece to a team that ends up making Worlds. I truly believe that. Leon was also much, much better on the brand than he was on the Ivor, and I think you just have to stick this guy on champions that can do damage because he just doesn't really know how to play team fights or even really play the early game when he can't skirmish and be super aggressive. Tarzan picking the Maokai I do not think was the right decision. We'll get into that. I think it was way too passive, and Leon very much took advantage of that, but we'll see if that ends up being something that they target a bit more moving forward. The Zyra obviously stayed banned, but the Nidalee was banned here as well. Perhaps we could see 3 bans thrown Leon's way. I don't even hate that idea. Is MF really all that necessary to ban? It's very strong, but honestly, it's not that strong to the point where I wouldn't consider just banning out 3 AP junglers and just forcing Leon onto something weaker, maybe even the Lilia, right? I think that's technically even weaker than probably the brand in terms of consistency. So we'll have to see. Photic and Shanji were fine. Shanji had a couple of great ultimates and some good fights in this game, but overall NIP just stomped across the board. There really weren't a lot of negative things to say about them. Rookie was amazing and Zhuo was also incredible. Leon had a great early game, and that was enough of a recipe for success for them to basically walk to this victory. And for Weibo on the other side, they kind of got trounced here. It's really hard to point out one problem on the team. I think the Maokai was probably the biggest one though, so I'm going to give dud of the game to Tarzan. I've gotten a reputation, rightfully so, of kind of glazing Tarzan on this channel. He is, to me, one of my favorite players in the world, and I'm not biased in terms of how I go about the analysis, or at least I attempt not to be. I guess there probably is some bias in there somewhere, but I genuinely think he's just a really good player, and the only reason I get frustrated by other people's opinions is because it feels like he's constantly disrespected when he's one of the better junglers in the world. It's the same thing with someone like Peanut. I think when you have that kind of play style where you are a little bit more of a facilitator rather than somebody who is going to play brand and just pop off like Leon, then you do fall under the radar a bit more, but the Maokai was certainly not it in this game. I know he's really good at the champ, but even something like a Sejuani I think would have been more proactive. You can't just give up the early game in the meta right now. It's just way too important. Getting an early gold lead is literally the difference between winning and losing a game in the LPL at the current moment, and Tarzan just wasn't able to really do anything to stop the brand or the Zeri or anything like that on the Maokai. So I expect a change in terms of draft philosophy moving into game number 3. Breathe was also really horrible, was just out of position a lot in this game. His macro was really genuinely horrible. I don't know what he was doing for a majority of this game, but he was constantly in bad positions and getting picked off for it. Xiaohu continues to be basically nothing on Tristana. That champion is just not built for him. I don't know if it's always been this bad, but I can tell you this year, it's been an absolute disaster. He just does no damage. Crisp was getting caught out left and right. Certainly different than game number 1. Light was generally fine, but how much can he actually do? Wasn't dodging skill shots like he was in game number 1, I'll definitely tell you that. So Weibo just kind of losing across the board, but at the end of the day, it's only a 1-1 series. You just tied it up here with a win for NIP, and so now you're essentially going into a best of 3, which these two teams have already played over the course of this year. In fact, they've not played just one, they've played 3 best of 3s over the course of this year, and so they're very familiar playing into each other. Of course, Weibo got the better of those best of 3s, but we'll have to see how it ends up playing out in this series. Game number 3 is super important. As you know, I do believe game 3 to be the most important when you're going in 1-1. So it's going to be interesting to see who ends up coming out on top, but who's going to take control of this series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and they've completely regained control. And quite frankly, this was very similar to game number 1. I think this might even be better. Even some of the deaths and some of the quote-unquote negative plays coming out from Weibo really weren't all that bad in this one, and they just got out to such a ginormous lead in the early game that there really was never any looking back for them. For Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, a lot of their flaws are just getting exposed by teams that actually know what they're supposed to be doing against them. Look at Leon. We're going to talk about him once again, but no Zyra. He actually gets his signature Nidalee, one of his best champions, but Weibo is happy to give that up if they have a game plan to end up stopping it, and that's exactly what they had in this game, was a game plan to get Leon as behind as possible in the early game. So Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, pretty easily, is going to go to Tarzan. This was just a beautiful jungle performance on the Sejuani, and this goes to show why I think Sej would have just been a better pick in Game 2. I think they realize that now, just in terms of, like, if you want that late game frontline tankiness, that the ability to control objectives and make things a lot easier in that stage. Obviously, Maokai's probably a bit more consistent in that phase, but Sej does so much more in the early game to actually be able to fight and skirmish, and not only that, but like control the tempo of the game in terms of allowing his laners to push up a bit more, allowing them to be a bit more aggressive. And so this was significantly better for Weibo as a team, and Tarzan was excellent at punishing. Now, a lot of the advantages that Tarzan ended up getting were through Leon making major mistakes in the early game, invading to try and 1v1 a Sej that I think he loses on his own, but Xiaohu is also missing from the mid lane and he just dies for no reason. Pretty horrible stuff. Getting caught out at his own Krugs is pretty bad. Like, there really just aren't a lot of good moments from Leon, and Tarzan was the one to take advantage of that the most, but you still got to give Tarzan credit, even if a lot of it was Leon screwing up rather than Tarzan doing anything exceptional. But he's player of the game. He definitely was the most important player on Weibo. Xiaohu was very close, though. In terms of damage, he definitely was the one to kind of make the most of it. Zeri looks so good in this series so far. The Smolder not looking nearly as consistent for Rookie on the other side of this matchup, just not nearly as much agency as you're going to get out of the Zeri, and quite frankly, this is Xiaohu's best game in quite a while. He's been significantly better over the second half of the regular season, but I can't just forget that he was like legitimately a bottom 3 or bottom 4 mid laner in the qualification stage the first half of the regular season, so still trying to break that in terms of my head, but this was a good start. Light continues to be awesome at these Misfortune ultimates. They're just so free in the mid to late game, and MF obviously has such a good laning phase. She's a very strong champion just because of the reliability at the current moment, and Breathe was awesome on the Kennen. He's the other player that I really want to shout out in a positive way. A lot of fantastic ultimates. I think the scoreline is honestly not doing him justice for just how good and important he was over the course of this game. So credit to Weibo Gaming. I thought they played incredibly well here, and this is a really important win to get their momentum back after that Game 2 loss. And then for NIP on the other side, again, it's all really about Leon just getting absolutely destroyed in the early game. You've got a pretty easy to execute comp so long as you go into the mid game relatively even. You know, the Ezreal's going to be relatively free to do his own thing. The Smolder might not win early, but it's Zeri. You can't really punish the 1v1 unless you're super out of position, which Rookie wasn't. But Leon was just so far behind, making bad decision after bad decision, invading at bad times, that it basically threw away the game for NIP. I know people have been talking about how Leon has made NIP better, but the problem is that he's way more volatile than Aki. Like, as much as Aki isn't going to be giving you the good games that Leon gives you, he's also not really giving you this kind of performance ever. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword when it comes to someone like Leon, but you gotta lay in the bed that you've made, because quite frankly, Leon might be the reason that they're here in the first place. I also want to shout out Shanji, who's just not playing well in this series so far. Breathe has been significantly better through the first 3 games. We'll see if that continues to be a bit of a problem for him, but he got R5 counterpick here, just went for the classic Cassante into Kennen, and it just didn't really necessarily work out. He dies super early on in the laning phase. He's not really able to compete with the pressure that Breathe has in the late game. It's just not a particularly good look for Shanji, and he needs to be better. Again, Photic is essentially nothing in this series, as he has been for a lot of the playoffs. He's really not been a huge factor in NIP's success. It's all going to come down to basically Leon, Rookie, and Zhuo. I think they're the 3 players that have to step up, but their backs are against the wall. They're 1 game away from elimination. They've already made the regional qualifiers. Not a ton to play for other than bragging rights at this point, but if you can beat Weibo Gaming, that's so much confidence, that's so much pressure going into the regional qualifiers that, honestly, it would be massive. So winning this game is going to be big for NIP, but of course, Weibo wants to close this out in 4. You don't want to go to a game number 5 against NIP. They've already shown that that is not a great place to be. So is this series going to be over in 4? Is Weibo going to be able to close it out, or is NIP going to push us to a game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series with a 3-1 win, and they continue to look amazing. In fact, this is their best game of the entire series. They get out to a pretty big early game lead, but that mid game, it is perfection coming in from this team. Truly unbelievable stuff. You just have to be excited for Weibo Gaming. It's obviously frustrating if you're NIP, but this run has already been so massive for you. That win over JD Gaming, getting yourself into the regional qualifiers, getting yourself in a position where you're going to at the very least be able to play for a world spot, that's a miracle after everything that happened in the summer split. After going winless in Group Ascend, you almost were untouchable leading into this series, but Weibo was just the better team, and that's where things came to a crashing halt for NIP. But again, nothing to really be ashamed of, maybe outside of this game. But let's talk about Weibo first and foremost. Player of the game and player of the series is very easily going to go to Tarzan in the jungle. I don't know where the guys' haters have gone. People obviously tend to dislike Tarzan. There's been a general consensus that Tarzan is overrated as a jungler, but I don't know how much longer they can continue to be on that train. This guy has been nothing but phenomenal for Weibo ever since getting picked up. You know, LNG struggled a lot until they figured out a playstyle that really worked for them once Tarzan left, because he was such a great facilitator for Scout. Obviously, I'm not trying to sit here and say that that was the only problem, but they really failed to find a way to get Scout on the same page as their jungler for a lot of this year, and Tarzan just does such a natural job at being able to make things work on a team when they normally wouldn't. Things were a little bit rocky, obviously, for Weibo at the start of the split. Nobody is going to forget that, but just as Ninjas and Pyjamas were never frauds, they just needed to figure out what they wanted to do, and Leon obviously came in and really helped with that. Weibo Gaming were certainly never frauds. They just had a real identity crisis, and the moment that Tarzan figured out, okay, well, if I just, run it, every game pre-5 minutes, if I'm just the most aggressive jungler in the entire league, then perhaps we can start playing through that pressure, and lo and behold, that ends up working. Tarzan was amazing on the Lilia. Those ultimates were genuinely unbelievable. I mean, constantly getting 3 or 4 man ultimates at perfect times to be able to set up everybody else, but I would be remiss not to mention Light. The 80 carry gap in this game was absolutely ginormous. Light was phenomenal on the Ezreal, just constantly following up on the Lilia, engages perfectly. You really couldn't ask for a better Ezreal game. Crisp, Breathe, they were both really good. Breathe was really great throughout this series, just completely skill-gapped Shanji, quite frankly, throughout most of these games. And then Xiaohu, he's the other player, obviously, to mention. His mechanics on Zeri are pretty insane, but the decision-making, it's not always there. He's just really freaking good at this champion, and I would expect them to go to it more because he looks very practiced and very good mechanically on Zeri. So we'll see how that ends up playing out, but congratulations to Weibo. They've now made the top 4. This actually puts them in a really interesting position, obviously, depending on what happens in the next series. They could be a team that's sitting in, the top 3 in terms of championship points heading into the top 4. So really intriguing circumstance for Weibo Gaming, but for NIP, again, not the worst loss in the entire world. Losing out in the tournament at this point, it's already been a great run, and you've already secured basically everything that you wanted to secure coming into the playoffs, and so you can't feel too bad. I think you would have liked maybe a bit more confidence coming out of this series that you could actually take down one of the top 4 teams, but it was not meant to be in that regard. Photic is going to get dud of the game. A pretty miserable Jhin performance, just constantly overstepping, wasting every single one of his movement abilities, and really just his flash at every possible opportunity by stepping forward when he had absolutely no right to. He was just really bad. The 80 carry gap was very noticeable in this game. Not that Shanji, Leon, Zhuo were anything other than bad as well. Rookie trying his best to salvage this game on the Azir, was able to pick up, a nice flank kill on Xiaohu, and generally speaking was trying to take advantage of any mispositioning that he saw, but at the end of the day, there's only so much one Azir can do. This comp is just straight out of 2020, and it's not going to work as well in 2024. Unfortunately, they just didn't have the pressure. Leon looked awful off of the Zyra, and specifically off of, Zyra Brand. He looked really bad on his signature Nidalee. It becomes even more baffling that teams just refuse to even try to switch it up, because maybe they would have found this out. Maybe JDG could have found this out in their series if they had even attempted to give it a shot. Shanji didn't look good on the Renekton. Zhuo, it's hard to look good on the Leona, but this was probably his weakest game. There's just not a lot to talk about in terms of game 4 for NIP because it was all bad and it spiraled out of control incredibly quickly, but again, you got to give this team their flowers for getting here in the first place. I don't think a lot of people had this team as even threats to make top 6, and so the fact that they ended up doing that is definitely impressive, and they'll have a chance to, maybe rewrite the narrative once we get into the regional qualifiers, but at least for now, Weibo Gaming coming out on top and looking pretty damn good doing it. And then moving on to our second round 3 series here. This one was definitely a little bit more lopsided on paper, at the very least, in my opinion. I didn't really think this was going to be all that close of a series because genuinely it's one of the best teams in the world against a good team, but maybe not one that is supposed to be on their level. It's the number 3 seeded Top Esports taking on the number 6 seeded Anyone's Legend. This is, of course, kind of a weird matchup. Top Esports getting kind of unlucky in order to get here as the number 3 seed. They've essentially been untouchable, undefeated over the last like month and a half, but because they lost their first 2 series coming back from the Esports World Cup, they made a very deep run there. They were obviously very tired. It took them a little bit to get back on their feet. They end up with the number 3 seed, just how it goes. LNG was a little bit more clinical in terms of their execution, and that means that they have to play an extra series, but that's not really all that bad for Top Esports. Mostly that is bad for anyone's legend, because this team is actually kind of interesting. We saw their win, obviously, in the previous series over FPX. FPX was kind of a wash of a team. I think that they are, you know, kind of the quintessential good but not great kind of team that is going to be interesting to watch in a playoff run, but isn't necessarily expected to win a ton. AL winning that series certainly was not an upset. It was not a surprise, especially with how this team performed at the beginning part of the split, but things have not necessarily been as good for AL moving forward, especially in the second half. You were getting a lot worse performances out of players that you really need on this team. Players like Shanks that have been crucial key pieces for what AL has wanted to do in terms of their game plan over the course of this year. Pretty notoriously, Shanks gets worse over the course of the year. He tends to flame out rather quickly towards the back half of years, and unfortunately that did carry over at the very least into Summer Split. That being said, he was great in their previous playoff series against FPX. Care was amazing in round 1, and then Shanks absolutely obliterated him in round 2. So if you're getting that good version of Shanks, if he's locked in and he cares and he's like trying, then I do think you're going to get a very strong version of AL. The concern is that you're playing into Top Esports, who, you know, like I said, is one of the best teams in the world. I mean, truly, they've been unbeatable over the past, like, month and a half, and I mean that literally. They have not lost a game since that first week back from the Esports World Cup. They have not even been tested, really, at all. This team has been genuinely unstoppable in that run, and a lot of it is just because of how consistent they are across the board. There is no weak link. You would have thought that could potentially be the middle of the map here. Cream in the mid lane was kind of looked at as the one unproven player, quote-unquote, on Top Esports going into the year, but that is just not proven to be true. Cream has honestly been the most consistent mid laner in the entire LPL over the course of this year, and so you feel pretty good about him. Tion was an MVP finalist for me, and he won the MVP award on the LPL broadcast. You know, I don't agree with that, but I'm not, like, entirely against it. I certainly don't think it's the worst decision in the world. The guy was excellent over the course of this split. JackeyLove and Mako have a real argument to be the best bot lane in the world when everything is clicking. I think, you know, Elk and On just edge them out a little bit in my brain, but you got 369 on the top side. Like, this is just a stacked team across the board, one that could genuinely win Worlds, and so AL is going to have to overcome a pretty monumental task in order to get through, but this is the series that actually has real, like, season-ending qualifications, Worlds qualifications, because of the regional qualifier. JD Gaming was eliminated, of course, by Ninjas in Pyjamas in the previous round. If AL is able to win this series and get themselves into the top 4, JDG's year is over. They are done. They do not make the regional qualifiers. AL makes it over them, so this is really the last shot to change anything up as we head into the regional qualifiers, but they're certainly going to be underdogs, so we'll see how it plays out. Of course, my prediction was Top Esports. I think that's pretty clear by the way that I've previewed this series. I think basically everybody has previewed Top Esports to be a team that wins this series. I think TES has a pretty decent shot to win the LPL, so I certainly think they're going to be favorites in a series like this, but we'll see if it ends up playing out that way. Of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, so let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Top Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this may look like it was kind of a quote-unquote blowout. I don't think this was a blowout. AL did a lot of really interesting things in the early game. They were actually able to hold on to at least some pressure in the mid game. They just weren't able to actually do anything with it. TES was getting micro advantages left and right, and so even when these fights were going relatively even, by the time we were hitting that 20-minute mark and, you know, a lot of these champions were getting online, there really just weren't a lot of things that AL was able to do on the map at that point because TES's macro was so good, and I think a lot of that does stem from the fact that bot lane was unbelievably good in this game number 1. Player of the game, for me at the very least, is going to go to JackeyLove. If you want to give it to Mako on the Poppy, I think that's totally fine too, but I thought Jackie was really amazing in this game. He was super aggressive, was constantly willing to try and trade things. This is the JackeyLove that is one of the best AD carries in the world. I think for a lot of this year, we've seen a different version of him. We've seen him on Senna duty a lot. We've even seen him on like Ezreal and Ashe a lot more consistently, putting him on something like Misfortune, where Mako can make a play early on and JackeyLove can flash in and kill Jhin just 2v2 in the bot lane. Like, that makes things so much more difficult for AL to play into because Top Esports is already probably going to win elsewhere on the map, and if you're winning 2v2 that hard without resources into Hope and Kale, that's a huge problem for AL. So credit to JackeyLove. I thought he was amazing. Those bullet times were excellent. His team fighting was unbelievable. I genuinely think he was the best player in this game. Again, I know a lot of praise is going to go to Mako, and he deserves it. The Poppy was absolutely huge. A lot of the setups were great. I just think JackeyLove was a little bit more aggressive in terms of the way he actually played the game, and so I wanted to give it to him. But, you know, you could really give it to either member of the bot lane. Both were unbelievable, and they were the strength of Top Esports in this game. Cream goes deathless on the Zeri. That's always a really good sign. 369 was hilarious in this game. I mean, he was unkillable at points in the mid game. They were genuinely pumping in like resource after resource to try and shut him down, and it just was not working in basically any situation. Unfortunately, he got a little bit overeager, overconfident in a couple of these situations, ends up getting picked off in side lanes a couple of times, but for the most part, he still was positive to this team overall. Tiam was very good on the Maokai, didn't really have to do a whole ton in the early game, but again, Maokai is so consistent at being able to establish pressure in like objective areas in the late game, and it makes it easier for MF or Poppy or even a Renekton to try and do something in a team fight. So overall, TES just knew the strength of their comp. AL, I thought, played well, especially in the early game, and there just really wasn't anything they could do because TES was just better, and that's a really encouraging sign for them. And then, like I said, for AL, this really wasn't all that bad of a game. I thought Shanks was pretty good. I thought Krako was pretty good in the early game. They were trying their best to play through the middle of the map. They wanted to try and establish pressure there because clearly they weren't going to be able to get it on the bot side. They did get a pick on Mako early on in the game with a gank in the bot lane, but outside of that, there was genuinely nothing you could do to salvage that bot lane 2v2. JackeyLove and Mako were just way too far ahead, and so Krako was going to try to be aggressive elsewhere. Some of those plays ended up really working. Some of those plays ended up really not working out, and you take the good with the bad with Krako, but at the very least, he was attempting to try to make plays, and I would so much rather that be the case than him just sit around and kind of wait for his team to lose. I thought Shanks was okay here on the Tristana, but like we said, the bot lane was just mega gapped in this game, and a lot of that is Kale in the support. It's just not good. Like, the Alistar game was not good, constantly getting picked off in bad areas, over-engaging when his team was not prepared to try and fight. There was a fight around, I believe it was Grubs, where he just fully engages and the team just completely runs away and he just dies for no reason. Like, that kind of stuff, just being off kilter with the rest of the calls on the team, him being over-aggressive in situations that, you know, they probably shouldn't be aggressive in. It ended up really costing AL. I'm a big fan of Kale in the support position, but it just didn't look good here. Hope also was, like, really bad on the Jhin. His positioning was really horrible. His laning was atrocious, and honestly, he didn't really do anything this game. I don't think the bot lane played well at all. If they're going to get stomped like this, if they're going to clearly be the worst of these two bot lanes as much as they were in this game, this series is not going to be particularly close, and that's going to be a bit of a problem for AL. But again, if you show some aggression in the middle of the map, perhaps you can actually generate some gold, and this team wasn't completely out of it. They were just going into the, 16, 17 minute mark down like 2k gold, and then it just ballooned into something else. And so, for AL, I think that there is something there, but they got to step it up, and honestly, like, they have to somehow force TES to get out of their comfort zone, because if they're allowed to do what they did this game, there's no way they're going to lose. But for TES, all good for now. No worries through the first game, and this is kind of what you expected. Even with AL attempting to do things, you were still looking pretty good. If you're going to be able to carry that over into game 2 and get that 2-0 lead, that's dominant. AL needs to win this game 2 because you're not winning 3 in a row against Top Esports. That's just a crazy ask. So big game number 2 here from both teams, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and this is a pretty important win for them. Like I said, going down 0-2 in a series like this is kind of a death sentence. You're not going to win 3 games in a row easily against Top Esports. You needed to be able to come out here and tie this up, and that's exactly what they were able to do. Credit to AL. They found their win condition. They knew exactly who their best player was, and they played entirely through him, and it ended up really working out. For TES, just a little bit overeager, a little bit too aggressive in this game. Again, I've said this a ton on this channel, but I would much rather a team lose by being too aggressive than too passive. It really shows that they are willing to go out there and take risks. Not always going to work, but for the most part, at least you're attempting to do something. For AL, though, let's talk about Ale. He was unbelievable in this game. Player of the game for sure in game number 2. The damage he was able to output on the Jace was incredible, and this has kind of been the case for the entire split for Ale. When he's able to get ahead, when he's really able to snowball a game out of control, he looks dominant, basically unstoppable. The problem is, in a lot of other circumstances, he's really just kind of a guy for AL, and it makes it a lot more difficult for them to be able to play around him consistently. He's not really really been all that great on tanks, and he's really not been consistent at getting leads even on carries, but man, when he is able to get some gold, there is almost nobody in the LPL I trust more to just completely demolish a game at the current moment, and he has been a huge upgrade. I know people talk about the coaching staff coming in and being a big thing to turn things around for AL, and trust me, I'm sure the infrastructure is significantly better with Tabe in here. I'm sure that, just the general vibe in the facility is a lot more positive and a lot more upbeat, and generally speaking, I think that they feel a lot more confident in their abilities to play with the amount of resources this org has invested into helping them win. But Ale coming into the top lane, I think it's being undersold how important it was for this team because of just, the impact of Tabe in general. So Ale, coming in here with the Jason looking unbelievably good. He did get a ton of resources from his team, but for the most part, that's a good thing. Shanks was also much better here. He was probably the other kind of secondary carry for this team on the Lucian. Really nice game from him. He knew exactly when he needed to play aggressive and when he didn't. He was even willing to die for the team when he knew it was the right time to do so. Shout out Ale, basically knocking the Renekton into him and killing him. That was kind of hilarious. But at the end of the day, Shanks was really good in this game, and he needs to be good. He has to be better than Cream in order for this team to even have a shot at being able to win this series. KL was really good here in the support position. The Renata was amazing. The ultimates were really good, much better than game number 1. Hope was fine. Still struggled a bit in the early laning phase. It's really just not his specialty, but was fine in the late game. Krako didn't really have to do all that much on the Lilia, was able to get some free kills throughout the game, but generally speaking, this was Ale taking over, and then Kyle really helping in the late game, and then Shanks doing some interesting things in that same vein. So nice win for AL, necessary win for AL. And then for Top Esports on the other side, you can kind of look at a couple of these players and be like, not so great. Like Mako wasn't so great, Cream wasn't so great in this game, but I think that's generally fine. Again, a lot of the problems that they ran into in this game were more from just overextending in situations where you didn't have priority rather than just losing out in 1v1s or things like that. And that's more encouraging for me individually as an analyst, because that's something that you can pretty easily fix so long as you are a good enough team that has a good enough coaching staff to be able to just wrangle it in a best of 5. And I trust Top Esports to be able to do that. Mako is going to get my dud of the game because he was just constantly out of position and constantly dying for his team on the Poppy. I don't think it was entirely his fault. There's really not a lot that champion can do when you're behind in the way that they were in this game, but and certainly something worth noting, he was constantly dying first in basically every fight, but Cream was also horrible down the stretch. In fact, I would argue that Cream was worse in the second half of the game, but Cream was also one of the ones keeping them close at the beginning of the game, and so, I'm not going to sit here and say that his entire game was horrible. I just think the second half of his game was horrible. His late game was pretty terrible on the Tristana. Jackie Love, Tion, 369, they were there. 369 not so good in this game on the Renekton, definitely outplayed by Ale in basically every circumstance, but there's not a lot that Tion or Jackie Love could have done here. I still think Jackie Love is the better AD carry. I think that continues to be clear when you watch the mechanics of these two in these fights, but Top Esports just didn't have the firepower going into the mid to late game to actually be able to 5v5 against AL, and then their risky plays didn't end up panning out for them. So the series is now tied up at 1 apiece. This is a very interesting place. If, AL can end up winning game number 3, all of a sudden this becomes an incredibly interesting series because, winning one of the final 2 against Top Esports, that is significantly more doable, but we're essentially entering a regular season best of 3 at this point, as we said in the previous series. So winning this game number 3 is majorly important. Who is going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and this is much more of what we expected in this series. This was just a slow, methodical, clean game from Top Esports. Their macro was phenomenal. Their gameplay was phenomenal. AL went for some crazy things in draft, the Draven mid, but even crazier, at least in my opinion, the Fiora top. I know that feels like a weird thing to say, somehow that's crazier, but in the current meta, like Draven mid, I understand you want to try to get pressure early on in games. It answers the Lucian relatively well. Like I get the idea behind it at the very least, but Fiora in this meta is crazy in my opinion, and we'll just say it didn't end up working out. Never really had time to get online and actually fight in a side lane, which is all that champion really wants to do. So, AL definitely with some aggressive decisions in the early drafting phase, and it did come back to bite them a bit. A lot of pressure early on in the game from Top Esports, mostly from the jungle position, but quite a bit from the bot lane as well. who's just exceptional. Like, they are so ridiculously good. We'll talk about them in a second, but player of the game is going to go to Tian in the jungle on the Ivern. He really is a tremendous Ivern player. It's so funny because we were so critical of the LPL for so long for never playing this champion because they didn't. Like, nobody in the LPL was actually playing Ivern. Nobody was even willing to try and pick him up, and now we have Tian, who's basically, like, playing him every game. At least in the regular season, he was just spamming this champion over and over again, and he has become one of the best Iverns in the world, maybe the best Ivern in the world, and it's been really crazy to watch because you just wouldn't imagine Tian to be that kind of player, but it's really fit what Top Esports has wanted to do, how they wanted to play in this particular meta, and Tian obviously is so good on this champion, so really happy to see that development. I think it's really big for TES to be able to branch out like that, and the Ivern once again was great here, and I think the big reason why it works so well for Tian is his macro and his decision making. It's just so good. He's always in the right place at the right time. Ivern, as a champion, does so much, like basically everything that you could want a champion to do, and so for the most part, he is essentially just a knowledge check. It's like, are you in the right place at the right time, and do you know when to engage, when to be with your team? He's pretty difficult to pilot in that regard, but if you are good at the game of League of Legends, if you're a master at the basics, then you're going to be able to crush this champion, and it's really fun to watch. I also want to give a big shout out to Jackie Love. This guy is just insane. Like, truly, he is absurd. He is one of the best AD carries in the world. I think he's right up there to me with Viper as like the most talented AD carry in the world, even if I think Elk is a little bit better because of circumstance, and I think like mentality really helps him out a lot with how aggressive he is early on in games. I think in terms of just like raw mechanics, I don't know if anybody's on Jackie Love's level in terms of what he can actually do on things like Ezreal. Crazy fun to watch. Mako is, playing Poppy this series. That's clearly the one he wanted to invest in, and it is working out for the team. I think Poppy is incredibly strong, and honestly, if you're going to one-trick a support, Poppy's a pretty good one to do at the current moment. Cream was solid. A couple of really big ultimates, some callings in these fights that really did change a lot of the dynamics, and 369 was definitely the better top laner on the Cassante. So overall, you feel pretty good about Top Esports. Again, you expected them to go up 2-1 in this series. They were favorites for a long time, but doing it off the back of, a lot of what they were doing in the regular season is still pretty encouraging. But then talking about AL on the other side of this matchup, I don't like this draft. I'm going to be entirely frank with you. The Fiora pick is a complete disaster, in my opinion. I get the idea of it behind just trying to beat the Cassante. Like, it's very narrow-minded. You want to get Ala ahead. We saw what happened in game number 2 with the Jace when he was, like, snowballed out of control. He could just take over these fights and win the game for you. But Fiora is so much more difficult to activate in the current meta than something like Jace is, because you really need to get her in a side lane, and 5v5s are just, like, really broken right now, and especially with TES's comp. Like, I don't really know how you're ever pulling them apart. Like, they can force things down the middle of the map all day, and so Ala just ended up being entirely useless. He's gonna get dead of the game, was getting picked off in side lanes. Some of the trades were pretty good, but for the most part, he just got out macroed, played way too over-aggressive, and got caught out multiple times for it. I can't think of an actual positive play that the Fiora had throughout this game, and that's really not good when it's your kind of coup in the draft, like when it's your big like crown on the top of the draft. So not good from Ala. I think this was significantly worse than game number 2. I think Krako was also just completely out-jungled. Tian was amazing in terms of his pathing in this game, and Krako on the Zyra, a champion that is pretty notorious for being able to have pressure in the early game, like did nothing, was constantly behind, was not really keeping up. I mean, he was up in CS for a bit, but like truly, how does that matter when Ivern is doing so many things on the map? It just wasn't a great game from Krako. Shanks didn't really get to do anything on the Draven, but it wasn't necessarily his fault. I thought the bot lane was pretty good from AL. Kale was pretty good, in my opinion, on the rail. A couple of really nice engages, some nice escapes. I think he was trying his best, but there's only so much you can do on rel when the rest of your team is getting absolutely destroyed. So for AL, it just continues to be like a little bit of an overmatched kind of series. If Ala especially is going to just be bad in the top lane, if he's going to pick things like Fiora and not be able to win on it, it's going to be a bit of a disaster for them, but they have to win game number 4 now. Their season is on the line. Remember, if they lose game 4, it's not just the playoffs that they are eliminated from, it's 2024. This would be their last series of the year. So Top Esports wants to close the book on the Anyone's Legend chapter, but AL wants to keep that alive and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. Who's going to get their way? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series in 3 games, and they're going to look dominant heading into the top 4. This is a really good circumstance for them. I think this series went about as well as you could ask for. Maybe they would have wanted a sweep, but they actually fought back from going neutral through the first 2 games, which I think is even more of a good sign as to where this team is at. This was another just really solid game. I know the scoreline doesn't look as dominant as it was in game number 3, which just was this clean, slow pace paced, like really nice win. This was definitely a little bit more sloppy in certain areas, but honestly, it was just as good and a little bit more dominant in other areas. And quite frankly, that area was top lane, where player of the game is going to go to 369. 2 different solo kills onto Ale throughout this game. Pretty insane. This should basically never happen as Renekton. If you're getting solo killed by Gragas twice, you are getting absolutely obliterated 1v1 in that lane. There is just nothing else to say at that point. So credit to 369, he absolutely obliterated game number 4. Ale was so important to this team in game number 2 when they ended up winning, but kind of got exposed down the stretch in the fact that he is kind of a bad player at trying to play from any sort of disadvantaged state. He never really takes his foot off the gas, and that means in circumstances like this, he's just going to continue to dig his grave deeper and deeper as he continues to play more. So credit to 369 for being able to take advantage of that, but player of the series as a whole for Top Esports to me was very easy. This one's going to go to Jackie Love. I think this guy's genuinely just insane. You know, I'm an analyst, but like I'm also a fan, and it's really, really hard not to just watch Jackie Love and be like, God, I love League of Legends when it's played at a high level. His Ezreal is so clean. It is so fun to watch, and honestly, I just can't sling enough praise on him in terms of what he is able to do for this team. He really has been that important for Top Esports, and so you just got to be excited and happy for him because it just continues to look awesome. Like, obviously, a former world champion on Invictus. He's come over here to Top Esports. It's not been perfect since he's come over here. There's been a lot of ups and downs to this organization, but it finally feels like they found something that can actually really click for this team. And, you know, he gets to play with Mako in the bot lane, which I'm sure is a big positive for him, and he looks amazing when he gets to do this. I think he might have an unbelievably good playoff run. It's kind of just on the mind. He's always been a really high-level playoff performer, and now he's got a great team behind him as well. So I feel very good about Jackie Love moving forward, and he was amazing in this series against AL, even with Hope not really being all that bad, at least in the back half of this series. Mako was also very good. First game off the Poppy, it's on the Alistair this time. I think it's a good pick, you know, generally gives you a lot of options. Was often trading his life to allow setup for the rest of the team, but that's his job. Cream was also pretty good in the back half of this series, but Tian was the other player I considered for player of the series. Again, just a lot of pressure. I just think if he were a little bit more active on the Zyra here in game 4, then perhaps I give it to him in their third win. Not to say he was bad, not to say he wasn't doing anything or anything like that, just rather that I don't think he was like the focal point for how Top Esports wanted to play the game, and Jackie Love was a teamfight carry basically every single time. I don't think they could hit him with the skill shot, was constantly making the right mental decisions, blocking Lucian ultimates, and, you know, like just juggling aggro perfectly. Jackie Love was the player of the series, but Tian was amazing through especially games 1 and 3. I think he was really dominant in those. 369 obviously very good here, but Top Esports just looking solid across the board. This wasn't the most dominating series of all time, but the reason, like I said, it's so encouraging to me is because this team really hasn't been tested all that much, and this was at the very least them kind of getting tested. AL still was very much outclassed, and that's definitely a bit of a problem, but this team is going into top 4 with about as much momentum as any team could possibly have, and that's pretty massive for them. And then for AL, unfortunately, this is going to be the end of your season. For a lot of this split, we were talking about them as a potential Worlds team. They're not even going to have a chance to be able to qualify through the regional qualifiers for it because JDG does have more championship points from the spring split, but AL certainly shouldn't look at Summer as a negative. They were number 1 in their group coming out of the qualification stage, the first half of the regular season. Things weren't exactly perfect in Group Ascend, but they weren't bad either. They were a decent team. They end up getting the number 6 seed, and they end up winning a playoff series. And honestly, with the history of AL as an org, with what they've gone through over the past couple of years, that's certainly not the worst thing in the entire world. This org has essentially just underperformed year after year after year. I've kind of made it a meme on this channel that I've constantly overhyped AL coming into a split, and then they've just kind of been meh or whatever, right? Like, they've never lived up to the high expectations that I basically always set for them because I've always seen them having decent rosters and decent players, but this was finally the split where things started to come together for them. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough to be able to compete with some of the better teams in the league. Now, would this have looked differently if the seeding had turned out a different way? If LNG had been in this spot instead of Top Esports, do I think AL could have made something work? Maybe. I don't know. This team really isn't all that bad, but Top Esports was just a little bit too much for them to be able to go head-to-head with, and like I said, Ale is a pretty easy choice for dead of the game here once again in game number 4. Got solo killed twice by a Gragas. It's really just an absolute disaster in the top lane. There's really nothing else to say. He was horrible down the stretch of this series, but he was the reason they won their only game. So, you know, you take it and you leave it with Ale. You just have to live with it. But Hope, I think Shanks, they were good players in this series. They did what they were supposed to do. I thought KL was really good in this series. I thought he did a lot of really interesting things. Krako, while he wasn't as good as Tian, wasn't like miserable. I don't think he was particularly good, but for the most part, AL did their best, and that's all you can really ask them to do. This was a major ask, and unfortunately, they couldn't quite get behind it. So their year is going to be done. Their 2024 is over, and Top Esports is going to be moving on to the top 4. They have a matchup now with LNG, another team that has drastically overperformed throughout a lot of this split, and that's certainly going to be an interesting one to preview. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL round number 3 overview and analysis video here in the summer playoffs. Up on the screen, the updated bracket. After round number 3, we know our final 4 teams. We are in the double elimination stage of the bracket at this point. Everybody gets 2 lives from here on out. It's the 4 top seeds. This isn't entirely surprising. I think that there was some thought that a team like JDG or AL, I guess if you really believed in them, or even NIP, could sneak into this top 4, but at the end of the day, these were the 4 best teams in the regular season, and they have continued to be the 4 best teams in the playoffs here. So we can go ahead and go over and preview some of the matchups. I do want to have the caveat of there were a lot of technical issues recording this video, as I'm sure you can see, because this is getting out rather late. I think like a day late in terms of what I wanted it to be out on, and I've had to re-record quite a bit of it. And so actually, as I'm recording this, Weibo Gaming and Bilibili is happening at the moment, and so I'm not going to preview it super heavily. It's going to be over by the time this video comes out, and so there's not going to be a lot of previewing to do. I haven't seen the result. I don't know what's going on. Obviously, Bilibili are going to be big favorites in this series. I think they're going to be big favorites against basically anybody, but Weibo's looked pretty good. I think it all really depends on how good Tarzan is and whether or not Wei continues to be a really big stabilizing macro presence for BLG. Those are kind of the big factors, I would say. That's definitely the matchup to watch in that series, but you guys will already know how that goes by the time this video comes out. And then LNG Top Esports, I can preview this a bit more because it hasn't happened by the time this comes out. Top Esports should be favorites coming into this. In my opinion, they are clearly the better team, but LNG has been on such a roll lately. Scout has really gotten back into form because the playstyle has really morphed back around him. It's gotten back into a bit more of a slow-paced, kind of a late-game 5v5 team fighting style for LNG, and that really benefits a lot of their players. Again, specifically Scout. And so, you never really know what's going to happen. If Scout can really demolish Cream, and if he can take over these team fights, if Gala can really show up and be as good, if not better, than Jackie Love, which is totally possible, then LNG really has a chance to win this. But I do worry about Tian, or not Tian, I worry about Weiwei into Tian. I think Tian could have a really big series for Top Esports, and if Cream and Jackie Love really step up and they're as good, if not better, than their opponents on the other side, that's when I think it starts to become a bit of a problem for LNG. So I certainly have Top Esports being the better of these 2 teams, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that assessment down in the comments section below. Let's take a quick look at our championship points, and this will be the last time that I bring this up because we know our top 6. We know the 6 teams that have at the very least qualified for the regional qualifiers. Our top 4, all of the teams that are still live, 2 of them will end up qualifying for Worlds through the playoffs. Obviously, BLG and Top Esports have a pretty big advantage in terms of their championship points, but anybody can really take those top 2 spots depending on how things go. 2 teams of those will qualify immediately into Worlds, and then the other 2 will go into the regional qualifier with NIP and JDG to be able to figure out who ends up qualifying for Worlds. Of course, the favorites right now are the top 4 teams, but at the end of the day, anybody can make it work. JDG is talented enough to be able to figure it out. NIP has shown so much heart and so much uncharacteristic consistency that anybody can really qualify for Worlds. But at this point, we do know our top 6 teams, Anyone's Legend and Fun Plus Phoenix, have officially been eliminated from 2024. So that's unfortunate for them, but they put up a good fight, and that's going to do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL on this channel. We post about all 4 of the major regions, and that's especially important now with playoffs basically going on in all of them. That's the LCS, LEC, and the LCK, as well as the NACL. Tier 2 over in North America. Playoffs are starting up today as this video goes live for that, so I'm excited for that as well. But if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all